rocky island in the middle of the Pacific. American and Japanese forces shattered on coral ridges. How many lives was that patch of ground worth? In the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean lies a tiny island so obscure that most people have never even heard its name, Peleliu. Yet in September 1944, that speck of coral became one of the bloodiest battlefields of the entire Second World War. The U.S. Marines landed believing the fight would be over in 4, maybe 5 days. They had no idea they were stepping into a coral hell, a place where every yard of ground was paid for with human lives. Peleliu was not just a story of tactics or maps, it was proof that war turns every plan into illusion and every island into a graveyard. In this video, we'll uncover why a seemingly meaningless battle was fought at all, how the Japanese transformed nature itself into a fortress, and why so many historians from Sir Hugh Strachan to modern analysts still regard Peleliu as one of the most painful lessons of modern warfare. A small island, a strategic miscalculation, and a question that has never found an answer. How many lives are worth a nameless piece of rock? September 1944. Across the deep blue of the Pacific Ocean, a massive invasion fleet steamed toward a tiny, almost nameless speck on the map Peleliu. None of the young men standing on those decks knew they were sailing into one of the most hellish battlefields of the Second World War. The question had been there from the very beginning. Half the Marines will be killed or wounded, nearly every Japanese soldier will die. So was Peleliu worth the cost? That wasn't just an opening line. It was a wound that cut through the entire story, forcing us to confront the real price of strategy, where cold numbers on a map became bodies on white coral sand. Here, the U.S. 1st Marine Division, the U.S. Army's 81st Division, and Japan's 14th Division would collide in a battle where each side believed it was fighting for a just cause. Peleliu became the tragedy of misplaced confidence, the illusion of a quick victory crushed by the brutal evolution of modern warfare. A small island that laid bare everything: the arrogance of commanders, the courage of soldiers, and the question that still has no answer: how many lives is a patch of earth in the sea worth? An opening filled with contradiction, grandeur, and a horror you cannot look away from. If the Americans came to Peleliu with faith in a swift victory, the Japanese entered the battle with a completely different philosophy: to turn survival itself into an art of defense. After successive defeats at Tarawa, Saipan, and Guam, the Japanese High Command understood they could no longer stop the Americans on the beaches. So at Peleliu, the 14th Division, withdrawn from China, was reorganized with stranded naval air and engineering units fused into a single war machine, a fortress of coral. They abandoned the suicidal banzai charges, once the emblem of Bushido spirit, and replaced them with a colder, more calculated Doctrine defense in depth. Every hill cave, misty morning, and tropical rainstorm became part of the strategy. Across the island, they carved deep into the coral, turning nature itself into fortification. Deadly strong points like the Point Bloody Nose Ridge, Horseshoe, and Five Sisters were connected by tunnels, concrete bunkers, and steel casemates forming a labyrinth of death. Minefields, gun traps, and carefully measured kill zones awaited the Marines to the very meter. Before the slaughter began, they evacuated the Palauan civilians, a silent farewell to the outside world. And from that moment, deep within the coral rock, a new doctrine of modern warfare was born, one where death was no longer defeat, but a weapon to delay it, a means to prolong the survival of an empire already doomed. After months of secret preparation, the Americans believed victory was assured. From the warships, offshore naval guns thundered for 3 days and nights, and reconnaissance reports confidently declared, "The target has been destroyed." But amid the waves and drifting smoke, the Japanese waited in silence. From within the mountains and the bunkers carved deep into coral, they were ready for the storm of blood to come. Dawn, September 15, 1944. The 5 landing zones' white and orange beaches roared to life with the engines of LVTs and Sherman tanks. The young Marines believed it would all be over in a few hours. But the moment they crossed the reef, hell opened its gates. Artillery machine guns and 20mm cannon fire tore through their ranks. In an instant, the sea turned red. On White Beach, only one of 18 tanks survived. K Company, led by George Hunt, stormed the point in a desperate close-quarters fight, a place where screams merged with the crack of flamethrowers. On Orange Beach, crossfire from nearby islets ripped into the landing craft. LVTs drifted off course, units became disoriented and scattered. War correspondent Tom Leah watched in horror as a Marine's face was shattered, his arm, dangling an image that would haunt America for decades. By afternoon, the Japanese counterattacked with light tanks, only to be stopped cold. D-Day ended with none of its objectives achieved. The beaches of Peleliu, once drawn on maps as ideal landing zones, had become nothing less than a meat grinder. After the beaches burned under the inferno of D-Day, the next morning, D+1, the survivors were ordered forward again. Their new objective: link up with the point and seize the Peleliu airfield, the very heart of the entire operation. But what lay ahead was not open ground. It was a killing field exposed under the fire of mortars, artillery, and Japanese concrete bunkers, an expanded version of hell just beyond the beach. Eugene Sledge, a young Marine of the 1st Division, would later recall, "This wasn't modern warfare anymore. It was World War I on a coral island mass suicide under a rain of shells." The men crawled through burning sand, their throats parched, fighting in temperatures nearing 115°45'. Their drinking water came from fuel cans that hadn't been properly cleaned, poisoning many right on the battlefield. They lost radio contact, lost officers, lost direction, but they kept moving forward. By day's end, the airfield was in American hands and the southern part of the island was declared secured. Yet as the smoke cleared, a wall of gray stone loomed ahead, the Umurbrogol ridges, where the Japanese had dug in deep. They didn't know it yet, but taking the airfield wasn't a victory. It was merely the ticket to a deeper circle of Peleliu's hell. After the airfield was taken, many Americans believed the Battle of Peleliu was nearing its end. They were wrong. To the north of the island, hidden behind mist and jagged gray stone, loomed Umurbrogol, a natural labyrinth turned into a fortress. If the beaches had been hell of fire, then this was hell of stone. The coral of Peleliu was hard and sharp as knives, making it impossible to dig even a simple foxhole. Each mortar shell didn't just explode, it shattered the ground into hundreds of razor-edged fragments, turning the air itself into a storm of blades. The Marines crawled up near vertical slopes where the enemy was invisible, only their gunfire could be seen. The Japanese vanished into caves under bombardment, only to emerge again moments later, sniping with deadly precision at isolated American squads. The high points Hill 200 and Hill 205 became centers of a brutal deadlock where men fought within mere yards of each other, trading lives for inches of ground. By D+2, 1/3 of the division was already killed or wounded. Even supply clerks and radio men were ordered to pick up rifles and join the fight. One soldier wrote in his diary, "I've resigned from the human race. I just want to kill. I have no friends left, only targets." Meanwhile, on nearby Anger Island, the U.S. 81st Infantry Division secured victory quickly with light casualties. The contrast was devastating. Peleliu was no longer a military operation, it had become a collective sacrifice carved in stone, fire, and despair. When the Umurbrogol ridges had already swallowed most of the Marines' fighting strength, they should have been pulled back to rest. But that never happened because of pride between the two branches of the U.S. military. After nearly a week of combat, Marine units were little more than ghosts of themselves. Battalions had lost over 70% of their men, and every original platoon leader was either killed or wounded. The men who took command did so not because of promotion, but simply because they had survived a few hours longer. In the rear, the 81st Army Division stood ready to take over. Yet Major General William Rupertus, commander of the 1st Marine Division, delayed the withdrawal order. Perhaps he believed the honor of the Corps could not be handed to another branch. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or merely a final illusion amid the ruins. Under pressure from Pacific Fleet Headquarters, General Roy Geiger finally issued a direct order forcing Rupertus to let the Army's 321st Regiment relieve the Marines. But by then it was too late. Thousands of lives had already been ground away, all to preserve something no one would even remember who truly deserved to take Peleliu. If before this nature had been the enemy, now it was human pride that delivered the final blow. And from that moment on, the Battle of Peleliu was no longer between America and Japan. It was a battle between reason and ego. After the 81st Army Division was finally forced to take over the Battle of Peleliu, entered a new phase, no longer an assault, but a systematic siege. But systematic did not mean easy. Deep inside the Umurbrogol ridges, Japanese soldiers still clung to the caves, a network of tunnels and bunkers, a labyrinth of death barely a few hundred meters wide that had already consumed thousands of lives. By D+12, the fighting had contracted around the strong points of Bloody Nose Ridge, Horseshoe, and Five Sisters. The Americans shifted tactics, no more reckless charges, but in the words of Colonel Harold Harris, they would waste ammunition to save lives. Bulldozers, flamethrower LVTs, mines, phosphorus grenades, and thermite bombs became the main weapons. In the blazing inferno, Japanese soldiers ignited like torches, the ammunition on their belts snapping and crackling as they fell. Even when they threw themselves into the water, the flames clung to their flesh and would not die. High explosive bombs were almost useless. The coral shattered into razor-sharp fragments, killing American troops as well as Japanese. So for the first time, napalm was unleashed on a massive scale. Aircraft dove to within 15 seconds of their targets, dropped their canisters, then pulled up sharply to avoid the rising columns of flame. Fire swept through every crevice of rock, poured into the cave living quarters, and burned even the air itself. The entire island now glowed like a torch in the night. But that light was not the light of victory. It was the light of despair of a war consuming the very men who fought it. When the napalm flames finally died down along the Umurbrogol slopes, the Americans thought the Battle of Peleliu was at last drawing to a close. But for the Japanese, that was only the beginning of a slow, deliberate death. By D+27, the entire defensive force had been compressed into a pocket less than half a square kilometer in size. Colonel Nakagawa, commander of the 14th Division, reported that he had roughly 700 exhausted men, left short of ammunition, short of water, but still keeping order in the dark. When Nakagawa asked permission to carry out Gyokusai, a collective suicidal charge to die with honor, the reply from higher command was cold and absolute no. Hold out to the end. On the 32nd day, the U.S. Marines were finally withdrawn from the island. They were utterly spent. The fight was handed over to the 81st Army Division, who continued the grim siege for another 6 silent weeks, surrounded by the stench of death. By D+70, Colonel Nakagawa sent his final message, Sakura Sakura, the song of the cherry blossoms. Moments later, he and General Murai committed seppuku, ending the tragedy of a division that had ceased to exist. Yet the war did not truly end. Scattered remnants of Japanese soldiers remained hidden in the hills, fighting on in hopeless defiance for years. Some would not surrender until 1950. When the final gunfire faded, the tiny island of Peleliu was left with nothing but rock ashes and cold numbers: over 10,500 American casualties, nearly 2,000 dead. On the Japanese side, almost the entire 10,000-man garrison was annihilated. Only 360 prisoners were taken, most of them Korean and Okinawan laborers forced into service. Numbers that on paper looked like a strategic victory, but in truth opened a debate that has never been settled. Supporters of Admiral Chester Nimitz argued that Peleliu had secured the flank for the Philippines campaign, eliminated a potential air threat, destroyed an elite Japanese division, and gave the U.S. crucial insight into the enemy's new defense-in-depth tactics. But critics countered, by March 1944, Japanese air power in the region had already been wiped out, supply lines severed, and Anger's airfield, captured soon after, proved virtually useless. Admiral William Halsey had warned that the palace should be bypassed, and history in the end has largely agreed he was right. Historian Samuel Eliot Morrison wrote, "It is very hard to prove that Peleliu was worth the price paid." Had the United States bypassed the Palau Islands altogether, not only 10,000 Japanese soldiers, but perhaps thousands of innocent Palauan civilians might have been spared from seeing their homeland turn to ash. And that is the paradox of victory, where every triumph leaves behind a graveyard. Peleliu did not end with the roar of guns, but with the silence of desolation. Yet from those ashes, both sides drew their own lessons, and tragically, those lessons led only to even bloodier battles. For Japan, Colonel Nakagawa's defensive doctrine became the blueprint for every campaign that followed: dig deep, fortify, hold out, and force the enemy to pay for every inch. This model of the fortress within the earth would be perfected at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where tens of thousands more Japanese and American lives would be consumed. In that sense, Peleliu became the brutal laboratory of modern defensive warfare, a place where survival was studied, perfected, and paid for in blood. For the Americans, Peleliu taught a harsher truth that no map is ever accurate enough and no plan ever perfect. No matter the advantage in technology, firepower, or numbers, the ultimate limit of war is human endurance, and that limit somehow is always pushed a little further each time. Peleliu was not merely a forgotten battle. It was a mirror held up to the very nature of strategy, where the moral question still hangs unanswered. How many lives are worth a barren piece of rock? At what point does strategy cease to be the art of reason and become a justification for the wasting of human blood? Perhaps at Peleliu, humanity glimpsed the answer and then chose to look away.